They said he shot down 30 Zeros in a week, as if war could be told in a single wild number, as if a man's life could be measured in the planes he burned out of the sky. They called him crazy in the same breath, with a half smile that was not really a smile, because the word made it easier to believe the story. A sane man could not look up at a swarm of Japanese fighters and charge straight in, alone. A sane man could not come back again and again, while others vanished in white streaks of smoke over green jungle and black sea. So they called him crazy, and they told the story, and each time the number grew. The strange part was that the man at the center of it all, the man they said had killed 30 Zeros in 7 days, could not even remember when the legend began. He remembered the sweat on his neck when he first stepped onto the hot, crushed coral strip in the South Pacific. He remembered the smell of rotting jungle and gasoline, mosquitoes whining in his ears, the salt taste in the air that never quite left his tongue. He remembered the feel of young eyes on him, curious, hopeful, measuring him against rumors. But he did not remember ever saying 30 or a week. Those numbers belonged to other people. He arrived under a sky that looked peaceful, a clear blue dome pressed down against bright water and darker rolling hills. From far away it could have been a postcard, some tropical promise of easy days and warm nights. Up close, it smelled of fear and mildew and the thin sourness of men who had been here too long. Canvas tents sagged under the heat, their ropes black with mold. The airstrip itself was a line hacked into the jungle, white coral ground into dust by tires and boots, shifting under each step like bone ash. He was older than most of the men waiting for him, though he was not yet 32. They would call him Pappy because of the gray at his temples and the lines already etched around his mouth, but also because in a place where death came on fast wings, age felt like a kind of rank all its own. He saw the lieutenants watching him from the shadow of a revetment, their faces young and burned brown, their shoulders too thin beneath sweat-stained flight suits. They had heard he had flown with the American volunteer group in China, that he had fought the Japanese before Pearl Harbor, that he knew the trick of the Zero. Some had heard the newer stories, too, carried out from Guadalcanal like driftwood, stories told over mess hall tables and on the decks of transports at night. 30 Zeros in a week, a one-man war. He walked toward them, his boots grinding the coral, and felt the weight of those stories settle on his shoulders like a second set of wings. Part of him enjoyed it, part of him did not believe it any more than they should have. The Zero was not a ghost or a dragon. It was aluminum and cloth, wires and fuel lines, a pilot strapped into a narrow seat. It could burn. He had seen it burn above the brown hills of China, falling with a slow, surprised grace. Yet the first thing he smelled on this new airstrip was the ghost of fear the Zero had left behind. That, and the heavy, sweet stink of aviation gasoline soaking into hot earth. On the far side of the world, on a different strip carved from a different jungle, another man tightened the laces of his flight boots and listened to a different set of stories. He was 24 and thin as bamboo, with a face that could have been gentle in another life. The men in his unit had been told from the start that Americans were soft, that they lacked spirit, that in a test of will they would crumble. Their officers spoke of Bushido, of duty and death and the beauty of sacrifice. Yet sometimes late at night, when the lamps were turned low, someone would mention a certain American pilot whose name they did not quite know how to pronounce. A Marine, they said, who charged entire formations alone. A madman in a blue fighter who seemed to appear out of the sun with guns blazing. They too had begun to use a word that meant crazy. The first time the older American walked out to the waiting F-4U Corsair that would become an extension of his body, he ran his hand along its strange bent wing.
The metal was already hot in the morning sun, the paint rough beneath his fingers, nicked by flying coral and the careless brush of tools. The plane smelled of oil and sweat and gunpowder, and faintly of the cigarettes the mechanic had been smoking when he finished bolting the cowling shut. The Corsair was everything the Zero was not supposed to be. Heavy where the Zero was light, armored where the Zero was delicate, powerful where the Zero was graceful. The young pilots had been told the Corsair could dive past any Japanese fighter, could take more punishment, could spit out a wall of lead that nothing could fly through. They had also been told, in quiet hints and grim glances, that the Zero still owned the sky at certain heights and angles, that it could still turn inside them and find their soft spots. As he climbed up onto the wing and lowered himself into the cockpit, the older pilot felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It was not fear, or not only fear. It was the feeling of stepping into a small, noisy world where there was no room for lies. Up here, in the snug metal shell where the instrument panel crowded in close and the canopy frames made crooked rectangles of the sky, a man learned very quickly what he was and what he was not. The smell of old leather, of cordite burned into the padding, of the last pilot's sweat soaked into the seat, wrapped around him like a memory. He strapped himself in and thought, not of 30 zeros, not of numbers at all, but of whether his hands would be steady when the radio crackled and the engines roared and the tower told them to go. They had come here expecting a clear story. Back home, the newspapers and the newsreels spoke of the Pacific as a place where good men met evil head-on, where victory came from courage and faith in the right kind of machine. Young Marines arrived at the island with images of clean battles in their heads, of blue planes swooping against clean blue skies, of quick shore victories and cheering on the ground.
What they found instead was a long, slow grind, a world where the jungle never stopped sweating and the sea never went silent, and death came not with dramatic music, but with the flat, shocking crack of a distant explosion. It was not the dogfights that broke them, in the end, but the waiting in between. In those early days on the Strip, the Zero itself was more rumor than reality. Men had seen them at Guadalcanal, where thin, pale pilots dragged themselves from cockpits after white-knuckled dogfights, eyes wild and voices hoarse from shouting over the radio. They spoke of a plane that could hang on its propeller and pivot around you like a dragonfly, a plane that could appear out of nowhere at your 6 o'clock and fill your cockpit with holes before you had time to curse. The Zero wore a thin silver-green coat and the red disk of the rising sun on its wings, but what the men really saw when they thought of it was not paint. It was a shape in their nightmares, a flash of sunlight on wings, the feeling of being hunted. For the Japanese pilot, the stories ran the other way. He had trained long hours in the air, circling over the misty coastline of his home islands, until the land and sea below blurred into a single gray line. In his training, the Zero was a perfect extension of his body, its controls so light that every breath seemed to move it. He felt the airflow on its skin as if it were his own. His instructors had told him that the Americans were clumsy, that they would fly straight and level when they should turn, panic when they should press the attack. They taught him to close his eyes and picture himself plunging into a crowded sky without fear, to imagine the enemy as shapes, not as men. It was not the bullets that would kill him, they said, but a moment of hesitation. When the older American pilot, the one they already called Pappy behind his back, took his own men into their first real encounter with the enemy along this new stretch of ocean, even he felt the sharp jolt between expectation and reality. The briefing tent had been hot and close, the maps on the table held down by coffee mugs and wrenches.
An intelligence officer, pale from too much time indoors, had traced lines on the map with a slim stick, speaking of incoming formations, of probable courses, of altitudes and timings. The words were orderly, the arrows smooth and sure. Outside the tent, the world made different plans. They found the Zeros by accident, or perhaps the Zeros found them. One moment the sky was empty, a wide bowl of clean blue above the patchwork of sea and island. The next, the radio crackled with sharp, overlapping shouts, and small specks appeared high into the east, dark against the sun. Pappy felt the sweat on his back turn cold. He rolled his Corsair into position almost without thinking, his hands and feet acting on drills that had been hammered into him years before. His mind went quiet in the way it always did at such times. Later, on the ground, men would say he cursed into his mask, or laughed or shouted. In truth, inside the cockpit, all he thought was, there they are. The Zeros came down in a loose swarm, sunlight flashing on their wings like fish scales. From a distance, they looked fragile, almost pretty. Up close, as the distance shrank and his gunsight frame filled with a pale shape and the red disk of a rising sun, the older pilot felt the world tighten down to a single point. His thumb rested on the firing button. The range closed. He knew, with a strange detached calm, that in 1 second he would press it, and in the next second, a different man, far away inside that other cockpit, would discover whether he lived or died. He had done this before, in skies above China, where the ground below had smelled of smoke and burned rice. It never became easy. He fired. The Corsair shuddered as the 6.50 caliber machine guns spat out their stuttering streams of lead. The sound filled the cockpit, a deep rattling roar that he felt in his bones. Tracers harked forward, thin lines of pale light that climbed toward the Zero's tail. For a moment, the enemy plane seemed to hang there in the sight, almost motionless, like a toy hung from invisible strings. Then pieces flew off its wing, the engine coughed black smoke, and the Zero rolled slowly onto its back.
For a heartbeat it flew that way, upside down, its propeller a blurred dark circle. Then it fell. When his men landed back on the coral strip an hour later, their faces were streaked with sweat and oil, their eyes too wide. Some shook with the leftovers of fear and adrenaline. Others, the ones who had fired and seen what their bullets did, were suddenly quiet. The ground crew swarmed the planes, hands and eyes moving over skin and seams, counting holes. One of them, a kid from Kansas whose hands were always dirty with grease, slid his fingers through a long tear in a wing and felt the raw, sharp edges of metal under the paint. He had never seen a Zero, except in the blurry photos posted on the mess hall walls, but he had counted them on a board that morning when they'd sent the planes up. Now, as Pappy climbed down from his cockpit and lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the kid looked up and asked, "How many this time, sir?" Pappy took a drag, tasting the harsh, comforting bite of tobacco cutting through the gasoline fumes and the metallic tang of blood. Someone's glove had split, and there was a small cut on his own hand he hadn't noticed. He hesitated a second. It meant nothing to him, the number. Not just now. The Zeros he had seen that day existed as fragments, the wing that snapped off, the spiral of smoke, the pilot he glimpsed for a brief second slumped forward against his belts. But the kid's eyes were on him, and behind the kid stood the others, and behind them, far away, there was a whole country that wanted to hear that the Zero was no longer a nightmare. So he answered, 3, I think, and flicked ash onto the coral. 3 went onto the board, chalk squeating against wood. Somewhere, someone rounded up. By evening, over coffee that tasted of rust and powdered milk, a corporal told a visiting radio man that Pappy had gotten 4. By midnight, squeezed into her canvas folding chair beneath a single buzzing bulb, the radio man tapped a message to a ship over the horizon that spoke of 5.
On a different island, where another group of men huddled around the same glow of yellow light, someone read that message and shook his head in pleased disbelief. "That crazy Marine," he said. "He's on a tear. They say he's gotten 30 Zeros this week alone." The number did not matter yet to Pappy. What mattered was the way the air smelled at first light when the engine started to warm. That thick mix of oil and dew and the sweet funk of the nearby swamp. What mattered was the knot in his stomach every time a runner came from the ops tent with a slip of paper and an urgent look, and the way that knot loosened, just a little, when he strapped himself back into the cockpit and felt the Corsair shudder and strain forward under its own raw power. On the ground, his thoughts chased each other in circles, chewing on mistakes, on losses, on things he might have done differently. In the air, for all its noise and speed and danger, there was clarity. Still, the stories built themselves. They always do, in places where young men wait between bursts of terror. Over tin plates of lukewarm beans, someone would mention how many planes their squadron had been credited with that week. Someone would say, "Well, Pappy's half of that, at least." Someone else would laugh and push the number higher, just to see the look on a newcomer's face. 30 Zeros in 7 days. More than 4 a day. Impossible, but somehow more believable because it sounded like madness. And in their minds, madness and courage were twins. For the Japanese pilot, on his own strip surrounded by palm trees and the rustle of unseen birds, the week did not have numbers, at least not at first. It had early mornings that tasted of tea and rice, briefings given in clipped, formal voices, sweat gathering under his flight suit as the sun climbed. It had the smell of their own fuel and their own fear, which smelled the same as the enemy's. He wrote letters home when he could, though the mail went in only one direction most of the time.
Once, on the back of an envelope he knew his mother would never see, he sketched the shape of the American fighter they had started meeting more often now. The one with the gull-shaped wings, bulky and blunt-nosed. Not a Hurricane, not a P-40, something new. Underneath the sketch, he wrote one word, strong. He had been told from boyhood that to die in battle was the highest honor. His father, who had walked back from the muddy killing fields of an earlier war with a limp that went bad in the rain, had not smiled when he said it. The young pilot understood the words in his mind. He knew the poems and the slogans, the talk of flowers falling at their peak and water returning to the sea. But inside his cockpit, strapped in, the canopy reflecting his own eyes back at him, he discovered a truth that did not quite fit the story. He wanted to live. Not to shame his family, not to escape duty, simply because the sunlight on the wings and the rush of air past the canopy and the feel of the stick under his hand were all too sharp and real to give up easily. He felt that the first time he saw the bent-wing American fighter barrel straight into a swarm of Zeros without waiting for support. For a heartbeat, he was so shocked that he did not fire. The American came in slightly high, nose down, guns already sparking. It was insane. Every lesson he had ever learned about tactics and advantage broken in an instant. He saw the white star on blue, the wink of muzzle flashes, the blur of the propeller. His first thought was not enemy or target. It was, he must be crazy. In the American cockpit, Pappy felt a flash of something that was not exactly bravery. It was anger, maybe, or stubbornness, or the deep, hard refusal to let fear have the last word. He knew better than anyone that what he was doing, diving into superior numbers, trusting in speed and surprise and the toughness of his own plane, could not be done every time. He also knew that somewhere behind him, invisible but very real, were a convoy of ships and slabs of airstrip and racks of fuel drums and young ground crewmen who wrote home on military stationery and wanted, more than anything, to see old age.
It was not the enemy that drove him forward, in that moment, but the faces of the men on the ground. He yanked the Corsair through a turn that pressed him hard into a seek, his vision dimming at the edges as the G-forces dragged at the blood in his head. The straps bit into his shoulders. He could hear his own breathing, loud and harsh in the rubber mask that smelled faintly of mildew and his own stale sweat. A Zero flashed past his left wing, so close he saw the chipped paint around its canopy and the flare of the pilot's scarf. He could have reached out and touched it, if not for the plexiglass between them. Time seemed to slow, the way it always did when the world narrowed like this. He rolled, pulled, fired. The week stretched out in such moments, and in the long gray spaces between them. Morning alarms that yanked men out of shallow sleep, their dreams still clinging to them like wet shirts. The taste of hurried coffee scalding the tongue. The dead, electric quiet of the ready room before a briefing, as men stared at the map and tried to look as if their minds were not miles away. The sudden roar when engines spun up in sequence, each one sending a tremor through the earth. Sunlight glinting on propeller arcs like halos made of steel. There were small, ordinary things, too, that had nothing to do with dogfights or kill counts, and yet were somehow bound to them. A letter from home, smelling faintly of soap and kitchen spices, even after its long journey by ship. A snapshot of a girl in a summer dress, her smile oddly frozen, pinned to the rough wall of a tent with a bent nail. A joke that caught someone off guard and made them laugh so hard they wiped tears from their eyes, even as they sat on ammunition crates. It was not the bullets that broke them, not really, but the moments when those small human details jarred against the vast machinery of war, making the absurdity of it all suddenly too sharp to ignore. Pappy, older than most, felt that dislocation more than he admitted. At night, when the air cooled just enough that the sweat on his skin felt like a chill, he lay on his narrow cot and listened to the insects outside.
The sounds blended with the far-off rumble of generators, the occasional cough from another tent, the soft scrape of someone walking to the latrine. In those hours, his mind was not on Zeros or tactics. It wandered back to Idaho and Washington, to logging camps and small-town bars, to a boy who had once thought flying was all about freedom. He thought, too, of the time in China, when he had watched a Japanese bomber fall in flames over a river, and had felt, not triumph, but a hollow ache that tasted of ashes. How many of these did it take, he wondered sometimes in the dark, to make anything right? The board in the operation shack, though, did not ask such questions. It had columns and rows and neat chalk lines. It did not mark the days when no one came back, except in small letters, MIA, KIA. It did, however, keep a careful count of victories. And so the week went on, and the numbers went up. 3 here, 2 there, 1 probables, shared kills. Pappy's name gathered tick marks like barnacles. The men began to joke that they needed a separate section just for him. By now, even he could not ignore the weight of the expectation. Before each mission, as he checked the guns and the fuel and the flaps, someone would sidle up and say, "Going for that 30 this week, Pappy?" Sometimes it was light, a joke in their voice. Sometimes the question was sharper, an edge underneath, as if they needed him to be more than human. He would grunt or shrug or snap back something crude to make them laugh. But as he climbed the ladder into his cockpit, he sometimes heard the number in his head anyway, like the beat of his own heart. 30. 30 what? 30 zeros. 30 bursts of metal and smoke. 30 lives. On one of those days, the 5th maybe, or the 6th, the days blurred together in heat and noise. A young pilot came back with his face pale under the tan, and his eyes staring at something far beyond the revetments. He had flamed a zero at close range, so close he had flown through the debris. There were scratches on his canopy where pieces had bounced off.
When he landed, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the stick, breathing in short, sharp gasps. Pappy climbed up onto the wing and looked down at him. He did not ask how many. He asked, "You all right, son?" The young man swallowed. His tongue tasted of rubber and copper, of fear and the faint sour of the oxygen mask. He nodded once, sharply. "Yes, sir," he said, the words automatic. Then, after a second, he added, in a smaller voice, "I saw his face." Pappy understood. He had seen faces too. For all the speed and distance and machinery, air combat had moments of shocking intimacy when another man's eyes were close enough to read. Sometimes they were wide with terror, sometimes fierce, sometimes blank with the narrow focus of men doing a job they had been trained all their lives to do. The older pilot thought of the Japanese he had glimpsed that day in China, silhouetted against a burning sky. He thought of the man in the Zero who had been so close a moment before that Pappy could see the white of his scarf. In that instant, he had not been an enemy. He had simply been another pilot, alone in his own small, noisy world. "It doesn't get easier," Pappy said quietly. "You just get busier. Wash up, write your folks, get some chow. You're flying again tomorrow." It was not comfort so much as a map, a way of stepping from this day into the next without falling into the gap between. On the other side, the Japanese pilot, the one who had stared in shock at the bent wing fighter charging into his formation, sat on an ammunition crate after his own mission, his flight suit sticking to his back. His Zero smelled of hot oil and scorched paint. His hands still trembled from the effort of holding hard turns, of wrestling with the controls when bullets chewed through his tail. He had lived. Some of his friends had not. That was the simple arithmetic the week always came back to. As he wrote a letter that rules would never allow to be mailed, he paused, pen hovering over the paper. How could he write about the man who had flown as if he cared nothing for his own life?
How could he explain that seeing such reckless courage in the enemy had shaken something inside him? He tried to describe the American pilot, but the words came out wrong. Instead, he wrote about the color of the sea that day, how it had been brighter than usual, almost too bright, as if the world below were calm and untroubled, while men tore at each other above. He wrote about the clouds, which piled up like mountains, hiding dangers inside them. He did not write that as he had dived for home, smoke trailing from his own wing, he had whispered a prayer that he would live to see those same clouds from the ground again. The week ended, as all weeks in war did, not with a clean conclusion, but with a simple turning of the calendar. Somewhere, an officer totaled up sorties and victories and losses. Reports were sent to higher headquarters, where men in shirt sleeves and ties would scan them over coffee and underline certain lines. One such report mentioned that the commander of a certain Marine squadron had increased his total victories by a surprising amount. The exact figure depended on whose record you read, whose gun camera film had come out clear, whose claims had been confirmed by observers or by wreckage found among the trees. 20, 25. The number 30 appeared in a marginal note in one version, perhaps as a careless addition, perhaps as a guess. It stuck.
By then, the myth had grown faster than the record. On ships inching their way across the Pacific, sailors leaned on rails at night and talked about the crazy Marine who had shot down 30 Zeros in 7 days, single-handed. On other airstrips, where other pilots faced their own swarms of enemy fighters, someone would say, "If that guy can take on that many, we can handle this lot." The story traveled without needing names, just images, a bent-wing fighter diving alone into a cloud of rising suns. It was not the planes that inspired them in the end, but the idea that a single man could push back against so much and live. Pappy heard distorted versions of it sometimes, usually when someone from another unit dropped by.
30 in a week, huh? They would say with a grin, half teasing, half admiring. Save some for the rest of us. He would roll his eyes, or mutter something about people who couldn't count, or pour himself another drink and steer the conversation elsewhere. He knew exactly how many kills were on the books, and he knew how fragile and imprecise those numbers were. He also knew that every zero burned out of the sky contained a man who had once learned to walk as a child, who had known the comfort of warm food and the chill of rain. Numbers could not hold that. The war moved on. New campaigns opened, new islands were bombed into submission, new airstrips carved from new jungles. Pappy's own path bent in ways he had not planned. On a gray January day, over the fortress of Rabaul, he pressed his luck once too often. His Corsair took hits, shuddered, coughed its life away. He bailed out into a sky that suddenly felt very empty. When he hit the water, lungs burning with the taste of salt and fear, he left behind his squadron, his chalkboard, his numbers. By nightfall, he was no longer an ace or a commander. He was a prisoner. In captivity, time changed shape. There were no flight schedules, no scramble orders, no engines warming on the line. There were only bare wooden barracks, thin futons, the drip of water from leaky eaves, the clatter of guards' boots. The smell was different here. Cooked rice, sweat, disinfectant, sometimes blood. Pappy learned the taste of hunger in a way he hadn't known before, not the sharp hunger before a meal in a busy mess hall, but the dull, grinding hunger that ate at his thoughts. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The men around him lost weight and small bits of themselves. Yet even there, behind fences and under watchtowers, stories seeped in. A guard, bored between patrols, would brag about great victories that had been won, enemy fleets smashed. A newly arrived prisoner would share, in hushed tones, news about who had done what, which battles had turned and why. Once, in the stale air of the barracks, Pappy overheard a fellow prisoner mention an American pilot the Japanese referred to with something like respect.
"A crazy Marine," the man said, "who had made the skies around the Solomons hell." Pappy did not say anything. He lay on his thin mat, stared at the rafters, and listened to his own stomach growl. He thought sometimes of the Japanese pilots he had fought, not as an exercise in guilt or pride, but simply because there was so much empty time to fill. He wondered which ones had lived, which had died, which now sat in other camps or on other islands, thinking their own strange thoughts. He wondered if any of them remembered the day an American had dived into their formation without waiting for backup, and if they told that story now with their own twist. He imagined a man sitting on his heels beside a charcoal stove, telling a younger brother or a child about the time he met a truly crazy foreigner in the sky. After the war, the world tried, in its clumsy way, to make sense of what had happened. There were parades and medals and speeches. There were also silences, places where words did not quite fit. Pappy came home with honors heavy on his chest and ghosts heavier on his mind. He stood on stages under bright lights and listened while other men introduced him as a hero, a legend, the man who had faced 30 Zeros in a single week and won. The crowds wanted that version of the story. They needed it, perhaps, as a tidy symbol of victory wrapped up in one man. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than people expected, with the slow drawl of the Northwest still in it. He joked often, deflecting questions with humor. When someone asked him point blank if he had really shot down 30 Zeros in 7 days, he would grin and say something like, "If I had, I'd be asking for a raise," or "Whoever counted was drinking more than I was." Inside, though, there was a small ache. Not because he wanted credit he hadn't received, but because the talk of numbers at all seemed to scrub away the parts of the experience that mattered to him most.
He remembered the week in smells and textures, not tallies. The rasp of coral dust in his throat, the sting of sweat in his eyes as he leaned over an open engine cowling, the feel of damp canvas on his back when he collapsed into his bunk.
He remembered the thud of boots on wooden floors as men rushed to their planes, the crisp snap of a salute given by a kid who looked 16, the way the sky changed color around sunset, bleeding from harsh blue to a soft, bruised purple. He remembered the taste of canned peaches on a day when someone had found an extra crate, how the syrup cut through the ever-present taste of metal in his mouth. It was not the dogfights that stayed with him in the end, but the moments in between, when humanity showed through the cracks. He also remembered the faces, the young Marine who had seen his first kill up close and had sat shaking on the wing, the mechanic from Kansas who had lost 2 fingers to a careless propeller and had cried, not from pain, but from the fact that he would never fly. The Japanese pilot glimpsed through plexiglass, just long enough for their eyes to meet across a brief gulf of air and fire. These were the images that rose in his mind late at night, when the bar had emptied out and only his glass and the bartender remained. The legend of 30 zeros in a week did not die. If anything, it grew with each retelling, smoothing out rough edges, turning human uncertainties into clean, admirable certainty. It jumped from books to radio programs to television shows. Sometimes the number changed, 20, 25, 30, 32, depending on which source someone had read. The core never shifted. One man, a madman or a hero, depending on who was telling it, facing impossible odds and emerging victorious. It was an easy story to carry, because it ignored all the parts that did not fit on a single page. Yet in quieter corners, among those who had been there, the story had a different shape. Old pilots sitting together decades later would speak less about kills and more about weather, about the way rainstorms would roll in sudden as a curtain and turn the airstrip into a slick, dangerous mess. They would talk about pranks pulled in moments of boredom, about the taste of the first cold beer after weeks of nothing but tepid water. When Pappy's name came up, as it always did, they would chuckle and shake their heads. He was crazy, one would say.
Crazy enough to keep going when I would have turned back. Then they might fall silent for a moment, each chasing his own memory. It was not the numbers that broke them or healed them, but the dissonance between the simple stories people wanted and the layered, messy reality they had lived. They had been told as young men that war was a matter of victory and defeat, of enemies and allies, of good and evil. They discovered instead that it was made up of tired mornings and sudden, inexplicable kindnesses, of fear and loneliness and jokes and boredom and beauty, all mixed together. The myth of 30 zeros in a week tried to make sense of that chaos by pinning it to one man's supposed deeds. But the truth was less tidy, and in its own way, more human. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the years after the war brought their own reckonings. Some became farmers or shopkeepers, their hands turning from control sticks to tools. Some refused to speak of the past at all, locking their memories away where no one could reach them. Others wrote memoirs, their pages filled with technical details and fleeting hints of emotion. In those pages, too, there were stories of encounters with an American who flew as if he did not value his own life. They did not always know his name, but they remembered the feeling of seeing someone who had been told a story about them, about Japanese invincibility, about the terror of the Zero, and then had chosen to test that story at its weakest point. The contradiction at the heart of it all is this: the man they called crazy was, in many ways, one of the sanest voices about what he and others had done. In later years, when asked about his victories, he often shrugged and tried to turn the question away. He spoke instead about the men who had not come back, about the way luck had threaded through their days, about the fact that for all their skill and training, survival often came down to a random burst of flak or a cloud in the right place at the right moment. He knew that calling someone crazy could be a way to avoid asking harder questions about the world that had put them there.
It was not the dives into danger that made him truly different, perhaps, but his refusal to fully accept the clean story others wanted to hang on him. He knew the Zero had once been a symbol of invincibility, and that his own victories and those of his comrades had helped shatter that myth. He also knew that in shattering one myth, his country had built another in its place. 30 zeros in a week, a number that never existed in the logs, but lived on, heavy with desire and fear and pride. If you strip away the exaggeration, what remains is still remarkable. A man, flawed and often difficult, who climbed into a cockpit day after day and faced other men who had been told very different stories about the same sky. He was reckless at times. He drank too much, argued too loudly, fought too hard on the ground as well as in the air. He carried his own private battles inside, against doubt and memory and sometimes self-destruction. Yet when the engines turned over and the wheels left the coral, he did what he had promised to do, not for numbers on a board, but for the people depending on the fragile machines in his care. In the end, the story of the man they called crazy and the 30 zeros that never were is less about counting and more about how humans try to shape chaos into meaning. It is about how, faced with something as vast and brutal as a world war, we reach for single figures to stand in for millions, for single weeks to represent years. It is about how we turn other people into symbols so that we do not have to look too closely at the ways we are alike. A Zero pilot looking out of his canopy at a Corsair pilot doing the same job in a different uniform. Two young men staring at each other for a heartbeat and seeing not enemy or hero, but simply another face. When we tell these stories now, with the luxury of distance and the comfort of knowing who won, we have a choice. We can repeat the easy legends, 30 zeros, single-handed, crazy courage, and leave it at that. Or we can look a little deeper, past the numbers carved into monuments and the tally marks on squadron boards, into the quiet, ordinary moments that made up most of those days.
The moments when a pilot wrote a letter he knew might never be sent, or a mechanic slipped an extra chocolate bar into a flyer's pocket before a dangerous mission, or a prisoner of war lay awake listening to rain on a tin roof and wondered if his enemy was hearing the same sound somewhere else. The contradiction that opened this story remains, but it has changed shape. They called him crazy, and they said he shot down 30 zeros in a week. The truth is that he was a man, like the ones who flew against him, pushed into an extreme situation by forces far beyond his control. In that pressure, he did extraordinary things, both admirable and troubling. The numbers will always be argued over. The human cost, though, is beyond counting. And in the quiet spaces of history, away from the noisy myths, there are thousands more stories like his, waiting to be remembered.